It's a high-tech conversation
and a low-tech topic.
live on the World Wide Web via Zoom. Bench Talk 101.
Right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bench Talk 101. This week on our topic talks, we're going to talk about literature again. This time, rather than talking about old books, we will talk about the earliest literature on woodworking. So not just our favorite books, but the earliest literature on woodworking. So I'm going to ask you to do the same as we do every week, and ask you to pop your names in the chat if you'd like to talk, and I'll ask you when it's your turn. This week we're going to kick it off with Andy Tuckwell. Since last week he clearly had a fair amount of knowledge to share, and I believe he's got some notes ready for us already. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Shrenik. Yeah, we were talking about the sort of the date when reading books became a useful thing for a tradesman to do. And although I expect everyone here is familiar with the handful of now much better known, really quite early books, they probably either weren't intended for tradesmen to buy, or were too expensive for tradesmen to buy, or were produced in too small numbers. And I'm thinking, obviously the one that people like to come back to is Moxon's Mechanic Exercises as the first DIY book, if you like, issued in installments, covering not just woodworking trades, but smithing, sundialing, bricklaying, and so on. And it's not really a DIY guide, is it? It's a description. I think it's probably been more use so that somebody that was employing tradespeople could understand a bit of what they were up to, and talk to them in their own language. And alongside that, there were wonderful projects like the French encyclopedists, the Diderot and D'Alembert, trying to produce the Wikipedia of its time, the description of all human knowledge that included trades, professions, what people did, the tools they used. Wonderful resource as a historical snapshot. But these books were really expensive. These were big folio volumes for gentlemen's libraries. They were way beyond the reach of the working man. And quite a few of us, I'm sure, will have some of the Lost Art Press reprints from Jean-Jacques Roubaud. And at least there is the difference that he was a tradesman describing from his own experience. But still, back in the 17th century, that was, wasn't it? The production costs were so high, and to be illustrated, the books needed to be so lavishly produced that they were far more about informing the ruling classes. And the discussion that we had sort of got into the area of, well, it was sometime in the 19th century, wasn't it? And I'm no historian, I've not studied history, and all I've done is do a quick search on a few historical essays. And a theme that I found was, although a lot of social history books covering England at the moment will say that the big event was 1870, when for the first time primary education was made compulsory. Far more modern historians want to go back a bit and say, actually, education was pretty good in England from the beginning of the 19th century in terms of the tradesman class being literate and numerate enough to do their job. So rates of literacy in Britain and in the US were pretty high. If somebody needed to be able to read, they probably could. But the other factors that we guessed at, again, I found confirmation of that there were several things coming together which were steam-driven printing presses, which really got going with the rotary press in about 1843. The mechanisation of paper manufacture. I found a statistic that said in 1810, 25% of Britain's paper was machine made, but by 1855, 94% of it was. There's a bit of industrial history that's not terribly well known, a lot of it in southern England along tributaries of the River Thames, of establishment of large-scale steam-fired paper mills. And there's bits of the canal system where the earliest trade that they took and the longest lasting trade that they took was daily deliveries of boats full of coal to fire the steam-driven paper mills. Because with the cost of printing reducing and the amount of literacy increasing and the demand for books increasing, the actual amounts of paper consumed went up and up and up. And don't forget as well that at the time, paper was the means of communication. It was the basis of all commerce. Everything, if you wanted to order something from a remote supplier, you wrote them a letter until the telegraph got going. But it still remained, the ordinary person's bulk communication. And another significant couple of events was that there had been excise duty on newspapers and on paper, and they disappeared in 1855 and 1861, and that was heralded by social reformers as getting rid of a tax on knowledge, and people were aware that they needed widespread affordable printing. So from as far as I can see from my little scratching around, it really gets going from the 1840s onwards. And one interesting book that I found that you can read on archive.org, virtually everything I'm referring to is available online, and I can make sure that Shrenik's got a set of URLs to share with everyone. George Dodd's Days at the Factories. And this is a sort of 500-page compendium of little essays about the industries of Britain. And it's a bit like, we're a great industrial country, we can do all this stuff. I think it was probably also presented as respectable Sunday reading. Some parts of the Victorian age, ordinary frivolous matter was unsuitable to be reading, for you to be reading on a Sunday. And there was a whole subgenre of publishing devoted to rather dry but respectable material of a slightly elevating instructional character to be read. And so although maybe Victorian children would rather have been outside playing with something in the street, it's nice for us that these essays were written that go into a lot of detail to describe the inside of a glassworks, a sawmill, a coal mine, or whatever. And in the chapter in there about the printing works, with its sort of breathlessly enthusiastic description of how steam power makes all this stuff work at great speed, it actually says, whether we say that cheap literature has given a spur to printing, or that printing has given a spur to cheap literature, or which is perhaps the most correct of the three, that each has received advancement from the other, it is clear that the printing establishments of the present day excel both in extent and completeness those of any former period. And at the time, the bookbinding seemed to lag a bit behind. The big printing works in the 1840s, the bookbinding section is a collection of craftspeople working at benches with their hands. But I'm sure that machinery to stitch books together and to put them into board covers came along pretty quickly afterwards. One significant publication that I found from about that period, I was looking at periodicals, and the weekly magazine, The Builder, which is still going, started in 1842, a penny halfpenny per issue, with the explicit claim of being not only aimed at wealthy architects and property developers, but also at tradespeople, site supervisors, clerks of works, foremen, workmen, and priced so that they could buy it. Although I must say, having read through the first few issues, it took them a while to get going with anything that I would call practical. And the first issue doesn't really tell you very much about how to do building. It gives you a long, pious essay about William of Wykeham, the medieval architect of Winchester and Oxford. It gives you a sort of essay about how journeymen and mechanics ought to conduct themselves and how their employers should treat them. But I think later on it does get going, and it, there are many other examples after that date that'll also be of interest. Oh, and in their first issue, they actually count up the number of carpenters, and they say there's probably 150,000 carpenters in the United Kingdom. And at the moment, they haven't got any source of affordable literature, no proper food for the mind, no books at moderate prices and in suitable parcels. And if we accept the issue in parts and numbers of works of those, such as by Mr. Peter Nicholson, the large scale of which confirms the truth of our convictions, nothing in the shape of a trade instructor or magazine has yet been offered to this immense body. So I think we saw some of the Nicholson scale books last time. Again, this is big folio volumes for the gentleman's library or the architect's practice. But what happened, I mean, I've got examples from the 70s, which is a bit later. You began to get nice little series of pocket books. This is Veal's Elementary series. Here's one on building, one on mechanism, which describes the huge advance in lathe design with the introduction of the slide rest by Naismith. These were £1 and 6p. They were affordable by working men. And the lists at the end make it clear that although I don't own any of them, there were a lot on carpentry and joinery, including things like a 1 and 6p version of Treadgold's Carpentry, which was one of the big expensive books. And that's a trend that carried on as you get sort of into the end of the 19th century, turning into the 20th. Another really nice series, I think, is the Handy Books for Handicrafts from Crosby and Lockwood. These are both edited by Paul Hasluck. That's probably a name that people know. Cabinet Workers Handy Book. I think here there's a crossover. They're sort of aimed at the working man, and he may have been taken in by the titles in the adverts, but they're probably more suitable for the amateur. Again, around about the turn of the century, the Woodworker starts up, and that's a couple of the early, these are 1904. This is the Woodworker and Art Metalworker, as it briefly was. Sorry, I'm trying to see the screen while I'm covering it up. These clearly were a mixture of trade and craft and amateur, and there's designs for repoussé work, designs for fretwork. This one, for instance, it came with a pull-out plan for making extending tables. Yeah, nice little project to get your gentleman's toolkit out when you come home from the city of an evening. And in the same sort of vein, same publishers, the Amateur's Practical Aid series. I'm waving a metalworking one because that's one I own, but again, you can read PDFs of the woodworking numbers. And the one last thing that I mentioned, and I'll let other people get a word in, around the same time in the 1870s, seems to be about the time that technical colleges were beginning to get their act together in offering qualifications. Qualifications need a course of study. A course of study needs a textbook. There's the example I showed before. This is notes on building construction, but it includes nice detailed descriptions of carpentry joints and such like, and was clearly geared towards examinations. And some of the early issues, the woodworker, they're describing the city and guilds exams that were beginning to be established. And one more to wave, which I can recommend. Steering away from the professionals for a moment, Amateur Work Illustrated. Again, is exploiting the development in cheap printing and issued in weekly numbers at a penny a time, but you could have them bound up into this handsome decorative volume to make your house look lovely. Full of discussions that people would find very recognizable, how to make circular saw accessory attachments to go on your lathe, that sort of thing. Same sort of thing in America. There was a short-lived, lovely publication, Woodworking Illustrated, and the first issue's got questions about who makes the most reliable combination planes, which sort should I get? You know, it's not far before they're on to sharpening and what's the purpose of the nib on the end of the saw. So that's a terrifically brief little foray into the whole thicket of Victorian publishing, but it does sort of confirm what we were saying, that technical advances really got things going in the 1840s onwards. That coincided with more widespread improved elementary education, beginning of technical qualification exams, and a surge of interest in wood trades for amateurs alongside what was being written for the professionals. So the number of titles available becomes vast, and then it all washes over into the 20th century. The old books get repeated. The little pamphlets that the workmen bought on things like door making or how to do soldering for a penny. There were always a series of these. There was, you know, something for any depth of pocket. And it all carried on to where we are now. I'll stop there.
Cheers, Andy. Before we move on, I think you've got to answer this one question. The American book you spoke about, what does that book say is the reason for the nib on the end of a saw?
No, that was my speculation. I've not read through the whole year's worth. I'm sure that we'll get to that question, but in the time I had available this morning, I didn't quite find that one. But it just felt that the discussions were heading over very familiar ground. You know, what's the best way I should join these miters together? Should I glue them or just nail them? That sort of thing.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to move over to Jim. I think he's going to try and answer that question now himself.
I was actually going to confirm what Andy is saying there. There's a couple of things that's got to be taken into consideration. That was the cost of the actual printing, and that's obviously from the invention of the printing of the Gutenberg, where Bibles became cheaper from that point onwards. Similarly, in any field, I think woodworking, just one of them, many of them, things changed with the industrialization of printing and the presses. And but I'll go back, if I may, because I think Moxon has to be looked at as a fundamental in terms of what came afterwards. And I was reading after our conversation from a previous time, which, as you know, I've only got the turning version of the first edition, but I read Gary Roberts's reprint, which is actually a complete reprint. And it's interesting that the sections that were sold at the time when Moxon created the printing press that he made were geared towards what looks to be the period after the Great Fire of London. So with the rebuilding that was going on, particularly in London, from that point onwards, there was some form of writing down with the use of the first presses, the expensive editions, in the form of pamphlets from 1670 onwards, to try to prescribe the key fields of craft that were important at that time, which was the rebuilding after the Great Fire, and they include smithing with blacksmithing, which of course would be all of the hardware and all of the tools and tooling that you'd need for woodworking, the joinery part of it. And it's interesting in the joinery part here that it focuses very, very much on the building of housing, and the new housing developments in those days, which were taking over from the many hovels that were London before the fire. And then carpentry, the distinction being house carpentry and chattels within the house, and then turning, which is an interesting one. I presume that's all of the turning for all of the balustrades, balusters, and so on, and bricklaying. So those are the key pamphlets that are listed here, which would have been the turning one that I have would have been one of those 5 pamphlets that would have been in the first edition, which was sold on the street corner as literally not cheap, but as pamphlets that were small sections, which then became chapters of the overall. This is the 3rd edition. Actually, it's the 2nd edition, but there is an addition to how to build a sundial for your garden. So presumably that's got something to do with working out what the time was before you could knock off. But I did actually look through it, because if you're looking at the history of tools and you're looking at the history of the joinery of the time and so on and so forth, there are a lot of plates that relate to both the style and the type of tools that were in commonplace in 1700 onwards, from 1700 onwards. And this is just one of many plates that are in the book. So and it goes into somewhat detail about jointers and jack planes and the use of a rabbet plane, smoothing planes. So the actual use of the tools for the profession is listed here with examples of when and where they would be used in joinery. And just to show you what the culmination of those pamphlets were, there's the building of what one would typically see as a London townhouse, which you see throughout London today, and all the composite parts within, and then it, just having shown the whole, it then says, well, in order to make that, you need to create this, and this, and you can then go on to with quite high detail build a house. And so I think it was, yes, aimed at the artisan, the professionals, if you like, of the day, who were rebuilding London. But it also explains what they're actually up to the layman, and to potentially, I guess, what we would call these days the developers or the gentry, who could have afforded to buy the paperwork. So I think as a foundation, certainly from the beginning of books relating to woodworking, and certainly as a historical document, also a collection of items which clearly shows in great detail tools of the time. I think this is fundamentally one of the books that has to be on every single library shelf if you're in any interest in tool making.
Jim,
So, yeah.
can I just quickly give one quick footnote about the plates and the tools?
Yeah.
Which is, of course, that the description of the tools doesn't match the pictures, because the pictures were lifted from an older French book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I'm assuming that everybody here, apart from if anybody's joining with the French as their mother tongue, that they would. I mean, I've got the collection of Roubaud books, and all the other Autiles books, but I was just taking this from the perspective of Great Britain and the colonies. So yeah, there is a certain definite plagiarism here. I mean, if you only have to look at the Roubaud book to look at some of the similarities of some of the tools here, and some of them are distinctly continental, but the description does go into detail on what various tools do.
Yeah, if you read the structure of the plough, it doesn't match the picture of the plough. It's the most. Yeah, but it tells you to make a groove. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you want to go into relatively modern detail, you've got Salomon's Dictionary of Tools, which is indispensable and probably much more practical as well. But from a historical point of view, both Roubaud's book and this one, I think if you read them in concert, it gives you the basis of the start of the first time people had actually written down what they were doing, rather than it just being handed down through word of mouth or archaeologically discovered from Egyptians, Romans, Saxons, wherever. I think the work of Roubaud and Moxon, both relatively contemporary, set the tone for going forward, and then obviously, as you say, with the advent of industrialization of the presses and printing to make it cheaper for everyone, there was a free for all. It's the same evolution as the internet, I guess. It was freely, the technology, the network is now available, so everybody's making stuff to put on it. Back then, the printing presses were available, so everybody printed everything to help the everything from the housewife to do cooking and the handyman to come home to do DIY in the house. Very politically incorrect these days, but of course, exactly what was happening at the time. And so therefore I definitely would say, and I was meant to bring down the Roubaud book, but I completely forgot to bring it down with me. But as I say, the version I've got is in French, so unless you're into French, then it's a bit more complicated to read it. Thanks, Rennick.
Cheers, Jim. I think we're over to Stephen.
Okay, I'm online.
Yep, I'm just trying
to. Let's see what I brought down from my vast library of about 800 or 900 books, mostly on technology. Before I review them, let me discuss a little bit about my background. In the 1980s, my wife and I joined Sutter's Fort, and so while I was an amateur carpenter prior to that, the knowledge and the background of what was then, which is an 1840 focus, how do we go about rebuilding or designing and then building a carpenter shop that would reflect what was here in California from 1840 through roughly 1850, before the fort was sold. What would be the level of knowledge in there? So that meant that we were doing a lot of research, and we were looking for books that could document tools that basically existed prior to 1846. That was our primary focus. So anything before that. So my efforts were finding books that did that. Now, the Moxon book that here's one of my versions. I've got about 3 or 4. Before Lost Art Press, there was a press called Astragal Press, and they were doing a lot of reprints of the older books. And this is one of their copies of Moxon. And then I also have a leather bound in calf leather, which was period bound, that you would find in the 1700s and early 1800s. So anyway, so I got a number of different versions of it. So Jim and everyone has already talked about those. So anyway, my focus is finding books so that I could document not only the tools, but also how tools were used. Diderot was another one of my resources. And I have the full plate with the text in French that explains what's going on in each of the plates. And then we found some American or English translations of sections of Diderot, which showed the tools, and they focused on woodworking and the mechanicals. All the other stuff that's in Diderot, this was mainly manufacturing, building, tools, tool use, and so on. And they explained, or they translated the French description of what was going on in those plates. And then about 2 years ago, I found a 5-volume series of the Diderot, which had the plates, just the plates, none of the text. So all the reference numbers and things in the Diderot were not there, but every once in a while I'll pull out one of these volumes and just leaf through it and just remember all that information we collected, because we used these books and citations from these books and photos out of this book to justify to the state of California Department of Parks what we were putting in there, why we were putting in there, and the provenance that allowed us to put it in there based on diaries, journals, and letters from the 1840s. And hence our carpenter shop was constructed. Along the way of collecting books, getting back to how-to books, we have not found any books that just look at simple joinery or such, like that's discussed in Moxon and similar variations. But the how-to books that we have today, I couldn't find too many examples. However, I did find textbooks, and I'm going to show this book. Let's see if we can ever see it, is The Timber Merchant's Guide. Now, why this is familiar or why this is important is this book was printed in 1823. This was the second book published in the United States. It was the most popular book printed in the United States. And what is important about this is, with this book, you have a series of mathematical tables. And this is the kind of stuff you have to put in a book. You can't put this in a newspaper or whatever, but it tells you all the various equations for loading and how to figure out angles. And then what's even more important, let's see, is in the back of the book are illustrations which show what parts of a ship of the line you can get out of various timbers. And if you use this book and study, you too can make a 28-gun frigate and recognize what types of trees and what the trees are that are necessary to construct the ship. And back in those days, the United States was building its Navy. And we had some run-ins with those people across the pond. And by 1828, we had solved it. They'd stopped stealing our sailors off our ships and so on and so forth. And so the United States was starting to gear up and start building a Navy. And this book, for all the shipwrights that are along the eastern coast of the United States. It was printed out of Baltimore, Maryland, which was one of the major shipyards in the colonies, or now the states, the United States of America. Now, the last book that I wanted to bring out is, let's see, and this is by Oliver Evans Press, and it is again a reprint of a young millwright's or miller's guide. And you know, when you're dealing with joinery and this and the various crafts to build buildings and so on, you know, that's one area. What we're looking at here is, how do you build and construct either, in most cases, a water-powered mill, but whether you can use steam engines, which are by now starting to get applied to the old water mills and so on. But this book has all the knowledge you need to build, design, and construct a mill, including all the hydraulics information, all the physics, all the mathematics, the formulas, and so on. And this was done in 1795, which means this knowledge had to be gathered in order to produce that product. So we're probably looking in the 1790s. At the end of the book, there are pull-out examples. Pardon my shaking, but I have a palsy. Let me see. Not going over well. Anyway, it shows you how to lay out the mill. And there's more detailed inside it, but I just thought I'd throw out some of these sections. Like, these are the chunks of iron that you need for a wheel. Now, what's interesting is that we found this book and used it at the fort for certain items that we wanted to put into the carpenter shop. But a few years later, I got a copy of the plans that State Parks put together for the reconstruction of the mill where gold was found in California. And based on their state plans, they borrowed a lot from this book. So anyway, that's kind of an end of my section, and I'll turn it back to the group, unless you got some questions.
Thanks, Steve. I think we'll come back with the questions at the end. Let's move over to Josh now.
Hey, so I guess my comments are more related to kind of the history of work sort of stuff, the labor history, than to actually woodworking. But it's things that Andy's discussion made me think about. This kind of explosion of publishing and literacy in the 1800s is something that's talked about in a paper I read a few years ago by economists who went through and looked at newspaper ads. And they kind of documented these periods of time when first there were like no one advertised for any kind of work on either side of the market in newspapers because they weren't read enough. But then eventually they got wider circulation. They're read by the rich, and you had workers who would, you know, like they would find their one like literate friend or something like that and say, you know, Carpenter available for work or something like that. And so you had the workers advertising themselves as being available for work because it was only the people who could employ someone who could read. But then literacy spread further, and you started finding employers advertising for work, right? So that's the help wanted ad that we're more familiar with. And then with the internet and so on, you're back to this situation where people are just throwing themselves out on, job boards and stuff, and employers are advertising. And so it's all been this kind of this ongoing evolution as literacy and technology change. But also kind of related to this, and it's not a very old book, but The Joiner and the Cabinet Maker from the 1800s is basically it's the 1800s equivalent of something you would get from a school guidance counselor almost. It's this book written for 13-year-olds or something. And yeah, I'll post a link to the article I mentioned before. But so by I think it's the mid 1800s, you have books being written for 12 or 13-year-olds thinking about their careers. And it's reasonably descriptive, I think. Well, it has these couple of projects in it that are nice descriptions of how you go about building things, but it's also a nice look at kind of labor history. There are things in there like how people are paid that, like, if you took that kind of section to a business school now, they would tell you that's crazy. You should never pay anyone like that. That's just a stupid way to organize work and compensation and so on. But back then it was such a different environment where you had this master craftsman and journeyman and so on that essentially paying people based on a piece rate, right? So a certain amount per item made sense. Whereas now, like the MBA students would never say that's a good idea these days, because they're looking at a different environment. But yeah, those are both, I think, again, more related to work history and publication and technology than to woodworking proper. But I like The Joiner, the Cabinet Maker so much that I actually wrote an exam question for my students based on it, because I like putting the craziest thing in my class on the final exam just to see who's really been paying attention. The answer is not very many, but yeah, that's why I grade on a curve. So those are the books or the papers I wanted to mention. And again, I'll post a link to one in the chat. So that's it.
Thanks, Josh. We're over to Eric.
Hi guys, no, that's been really interesting. Shrenik, you stole my question. I was going to ask if Andy knew about the nib on the saw, but my next question is I'd always thought that all the tradesmen were members of guilds, and the guilds were almost like a secret society. So writing a book that revealed the secrets of how you did your craft, how you did your skill, how you made your living, would almost be like somebody in the magician's circle telling everybody how you saw people in half and make things disappear and stuff. It would have been not a popular thing to have done. So I don't know if anybody's got any views on that or have sort of thought about that. The whole sort of trade union-y secret society guild aspect of it, which I believe were very powerful, certainly with the stonemasons that historically became the masons as we know today. So I don't know. Anybody got any thoughts on that?
I'll pitch in with a quick one. I was just happened to be reading a book about James Watt at the moment, the steam engine man, and it makes the point that although what you say was very true of London, where the city livery companies did keep a very tight control over things, that just didn't apply in places like Birmingham, presumably because it had come up from nothing overnight almost to become the city of 1,000 trades. You could go there and set yourself up, and all that mattered was the quality of the work and your ability to find customers, and you weren't answerable to a closed shop sort of arrangement. But that's not a universal thing. The only other bit I can compare it to isn't quite woodworking, it's tool making in Sheffield. And it was very much a closed shop sort of a world there. And there's actually if you can stomach it, there's a long, rambly 19th century novel called Put Yourself in His Place by Charles Reade, that is based on the early story of Addis, a famous carving tool manufacturer, going up to Sheffield and trying to establish himself as a maker of carving tools without the approval of the unions, and running his own shop in a ruined chapel up on the moors outside town, as long as nobody finds him and smashes him up and burns the place down. I don't want to spoil the plot, but you can skim read it and get a good insight into some of the desperate measures that people went to in Sheffield to protect their livelihoods in the way they saw fit. But it wasn't everywhere. That's an end of contribution. That's all I know on that.
All right, no, thanks, Andy. That's been very, very informative. I hadn't realised that at all. But thanks.
I'm sure there would have been difficulties about people coming amongst you and taking notes and writing down the source of your own livelihood.
Yeah, it must have been a high-risk occupation to inspire folk.
All right, I think we're over to Matthias.
Yep, I've nothing to show. I don't own anything in the way of the older stuff, apart from the obvious Lost Art Press reprints. But what Andy was saying, I found highly interesting, and more questions that I'm throwing out than answers, I'm afraid. But basically, publishing is a business. You are and that business, it can be demand driven, or it can be supply driven, or it can be a mixture of both. So you can have you can have a gap in the market that is spotted by a publisher. Here we have all these people who want to know more about X, Y, and Z. Let's print pamphlets on X, Y, and Z and sell it to them, make them happy and make money for me. Or you can have someone saying, here we have these glorious printing presses, steam driven and everything, and they're fast as Dickens, and they're even faster than Charles Dickens, and he wrote fast. And what are we going to use them to print? And can anyone come up with something? And then you print something, and then you need to sell it. And once you sell it, you can create some sort of a circular motion of oh, I enjoyed reading that pamphlet on bricklaying. Maybe I should get the one on masonry as well, or on carpentry or joinery. So I don't know, Andy. I mean, you've been looking into this a bit. Did you get an impression of if it was more of the one or more of the other, or really a free-for-all from all directions?
It sounds like an ideal topic for a PhD, really. And I suppose one way to try and answer the question would be, presumably somebody's done a few PhDs on the subject, and there may be some really good historical research that we'd enjoy reading. I've no idea.
It's interesting. It ties in a bit, it's loosely, but a bit, with a couple of books I was reading a few years ago. I think it's Brian Lavery who has written a couple of books on the manning of the Royal Navy from its inception up until, I think there's supposed to be one more book if it hasn't come out already, but the previous one stops around the time of the First World War. And really in that volume, so going from post-Napoleonic wars through the long imperial peace of the second half of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, it's clear that the Navy becomes professionalized in quite a way that it wasn't before then, but also that they create for themselves a huge demand for getting people in there, because they weren't using the press gang anymore, and training them while they were in, so that they could actually do useful work. And that there was, with the Industrial Revolution, and apart from some periods of slumps and so on, that there was actually a huge demand for labor and a scarcity of skilled artisan labor in many sectors in the second half of the 1800s and early 1900s. So that there would also be an interest both for the individual to school themselves to make themselves more employable in an interesting, better paying job, but also from the employer's side of view, a great interest in creating a more schooled pool of work people to recruit from.
That's interesting, because that definitely still applies.
Yeah.
I mean, the armed forces are great at training people really well and then retiring them early so they can have another 20-year career using those skills elsewhere.
Yep.
I've worked with a lot of ex-forces people who started again in their 40s.
I just found a section in the Millwright's Guide. In the back, it's subscribers. All the people who pre-purchased the book in advance. And it lists everyone by and whether they got 1 copy, 6 copies, 10 copies, and so on. And then in the very end of the book, there is an advertisement section. So this is from 1795. So that kind of goes along with this discussion is who covers, why would somebody print a book and hoping on making money? Well, this is done by people who wanted the book to be made. And the guy went out and pre-sold it, so he knew what his profit was going to be when his printing company would print the book. So anyway, that I just found that out. As soon as you guys started talking about it, I said, wait a minute, I remember a section, and here it is. This is kind of a proof of why the more complicated books were being printed in the 1700s.
I believe that method of funding was used by bodies like the Royal Society when they were publishing original research, scientific stuff that was important but expensive to do.
Yeah.
And there's some story I can't remember about a really slow selling book that they published about fossil fish or something that took 200 years to sell out. It's probably in the Guinness Book of Records as the slowest selling book because there were a few subscribers and not enough or something like that.
Well, we had a guy called Smithson who was kind of like that. He was very rich. He came from England, and upon his passing, rather than sending any money back to England, he founded a society, which is the Smithsonian. And that was funded to do just that kind of stuff, is to underwrite research and write about it and file, make paper, have papers, etc. And the rest is history.
It's all history.
Yeah. Anyway, that was more or less what I had planned to say, Shrenik. So you can move on to the next.
Brilliant. We're over to Chester.
I think I'm
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Are you highlighting me so I can see what I'm showing you? Yeah. Okay. I think we've touched on a lot of things that are really great and important to the whole concept, including that of the different people that partook of the information that was published, as well as the publishers, the system of printing and everything else, including the unions. And I think the trades had a lot to do with what was published and not, and as far as the secret societies, the Masons and things like that. All of those things are pertinent to the conversation. and maybe equal to some of just the books that we're going to show. The books that I pulled off my shelf were predominantly about how to do woodworking. But there's a distinction between those different books in that some of them, as we said before, are perhaps for the architects or for the designers or for the wealthy man who studied art and wanted a good book in his library about different types of furniture and things like that, versus the average joiner, carpenter, or furniture maker, although there's good information there for them. This first one that I have is from 1853. It's a reprint, and it's the Victorian Cabinet Maker's Assistant, and it has 417 original designs for furniture with descriptions and details of construction. And it's broken up into, it's again, 1853, and it's broken up into specific categories. It's got some beautiful plates in them. That's actually the title page. Very hard to read the title. But these etchings and drawings were very extensive and beautifully done, and therefore were not for the average woodworker. The way they divided up the book was the first division in the book, they referred to them as, rather than chapters, but divisions, was instructions in drawing on the nature and use of the different instruments necessary in geometric drawing, practical geometry, drawing instruments, things like that. The second division is practical observations on cabinet making. And then that's divided into on the nature and applicability of the various kinds of wood suitable for cabinet work. And it goes through pine or fir, yellow pine, red and white pines, birch, beech, ash, elm, oak, maple, satinwood, walnut, rosewood, zebrawood, mahogany, cedar, and yew. Snakewood continues, partridge wood. You thought it was just a partridge in a pear tree, but apparently it might have been in a partridge tree. And then you go to the third division, which is the description of the plates, and then furniture. And all of these are plates on the actual construction of different pieces of furniture, whether they're hall tables, hall chairs, dining room and parlor furniture, telescope tables, side tables, and bedroom furniture, drawing room furniture, and then miscellaneous, which are moldings and steamboat railings and clocks. There's a lot of written word in here and descriptions of how to. So that's very important, but certainly the illiterate would not have much use for this book until you got into the actual drawings of the different types of furniture, the blueprints for them, for the making of them, sideboards, and different things like that. So that's 1853. The next book that I have is from 1882, and it's again a reprint. It is the Woodworking Tools and How to Use Them, a manual. 1882, as I said, and it quotes the Talmud that says, "When a man teaches his son no trade, it is as if he taught him highway robbery." I thought that was a great little quote from the beginning. But this one is more specific about woodworking and elementary woodworking, perhaps. And it says that this book has been prepared for the Industrial School Association of Boston. So there was an Industrial School Association in Boston at that time, and that society, having conducted successful industrial schools during the winters of 1876, 1877 at Church Street. So this is a manual for that. And it's broken into striking, splitting, cutting, planing, sharpening, adjusting the plane iron, marking and lining, scoring and paring, sawing, reducing warped to plane surfaces, producing plane surfaces that are square with each other, boring, joinery, and finishing. And it has descriptions on how to use the tools. So that's 1882. 1887 was a little book called The Cabinet Maker's Guide. And it was published in London by Sherwood, Gilbert, and Piper. And this is interesting because this this is again a reprint, 1887, but this book is specifically on the rules and instructions in the art of varnishing, dyeing, staining, japanning, polishing, lacquering, and beautifying wood, ivory, tortoiseshell, and metal, with observations on their management and application. This one is the 5th edition in 1887. So I don't know when the first one was, but it has absolutely, it has tables in the back, but it has no drawings at all. It is a specific preparing spirits, waterproof polish, bright polish, a great little book. And then we jump to 1901. So turn of the century, Benchwood by Goss. And this is a course of study and practice for the use of schools and colleges. And like I say, I tried to draw most of the books out of my library that were instructional, school books and things like that. And this is a course of study and practice designed for the use of schools and colleges, which is all about bench work in wood, specifically bench work. And it has a listing of tools that you should have for the course of study. And then it goes into introduction, which is the interpretation of mechanical drawings, and then consideration of bench tools, measuring and lining appliances, chisels and chisel-like tools, saws, doesn't mention the nib, appliances for filing and setting saws, and then it has exercises in bench work, spacing, pencil and rule, lining pencil and framing square, chiseling by hand, handling the saw. And it has more pictures than some of the other books, but instruction on how to use a framing square with a bevel, which is really very interesting, in combination, setting risers and treads. And then we jump to 1905. So that was 1901. 1905, this is a handyman's book, and it's by Hasluck, Caswell and Company Limited, London, Paris, New York, and Melbourne. So there was some communication there across the seas. And this is the handyman's book of tools, materials, and processes employed in working wood. And the contents are an introduction, geometrical tools. All of the books start with geometry and the math required for doing layout and measuring. Holding tools, paring and shaving tools, hand saws, tools of percussion and impulse, most likely hammers, boring tools, abrading and scraping, nails, screws and glue, timber in growth, seasoning, conversion, selection and varieties, joints, workshop furniture. And this one here goes into everything from the types of benches to the types of cramps or clamps, and different types of planes. So that's 1905. And then we jump to 1927, which is the Pencil Points Library, Good Practice in Construction by Knobloch. And I showed this before. This is actually a book that is more about very specific types of architecture and different types of methodologies for mounting windows in framed buildings or in stone buildings, complete with an incredible set of drawings, plates on sheet metal cornices, wood dormer window in a frame, wood double hung window in masonry. Phenomenal book, flashing, fireplace with dampers. It's a great set of books to buy. That's 1927. And then we jump to 1931, which is a treatise on leather belting. And I thought this was really great because it's 1931, and you would have thought there would have been more about leather belting earlier, but they're still using it in the industrial shops. They're still using belting. And this is a phenomenal book. And it's basically the use of mechanical power made possible through modern industry. To use power, it must be transmitted to machinery. Leather belting has always contributed a large part of this work. It has attributes which give it preeminence for many purposes in the field. Leather belting has been one of the slaves of Aladdin's lamp. If the wonders of modern machinery may be likened to the wonders of the Arabian Nights, like all slaves, it is subject to frightful abuse, given very little credit, and often used with very little thought for its faithful service. This handbook is offered to the engineering world with the hope that it may lead to a better appreciation of leather belting as a transmission medium, and that it would result in more intelligent understanding of its proper application and use. And it goes into every aspect of dealing with the leathers, physical properties of belting leather, methods of manufacturing of belting leather, belting practices, installation and care of the belts, belt drive engineering, belt research. And for any of you that don't understand it, there was a time before we had the electrical motors on every piece of equipment, we had belts to drive them from a single motor, whether it's steam driven or not. And there are different calculations in here and different methodologies for mounting belts to one or several different types of machinery, and how to control the speeds of the machinery through the belting. I'm almost done. I don't want to bore everybody, but the next one is 1934, and that is from the Henry Ford Trade School. We already learned that there were trade schools earlier in Boston, but the Henry Ford Trade School was something that Ford started after his successes with the automobiles. This has everything in it from decimal equivalents of drill sizes, the different tools, and there's a lot of machinery work now being taught in this, including aspects on different dividers. I think Jim will recognize that one there. And then wood pattern making, 1923. And this is, again, an instructional book for an industrial school on wood pattern making by Herbert McCaslin, 1923. And it goes into making the molds, the core boxes, how to, here's some core boxes and how to do that sort of work, mold making, bench work, pattern woods. All of these books always go through great instruction on the materials, the woods, and the cutting of the woods and the timbers. And I have a lot of books on timber, but I didn't really bring them out because I thought that it was more important to talk about the instruction of the woodworking. But some of these things are really terrific. And in pattern making, you're making an original one at a different size than the finished product. And then they're cast to make 100 or 200 of those. So that's 1923. And my final book is a 1990 Compendium, The Carpenter's Assistant. And it was published in 1990. And but it's really a compendium of older works, of older articles and research. It's the complete practical course in carpentry and joinery by Newlands. And it's part first is practical geometry. Part second is construction and use of drawing instruments. 3, stereography, descriptive carpentry, groins, pendatives, intersection of curved surfaces, knowledge of woods, theoretical carpentry, descriptions of woods, practical carpentry, examples of the construction of roofs, construction, trussed girders. Part 6 is joinery, moldings, Grecian and Roman versions of the same moldings, joinery, definition of mortising, stairs, hand railings. And it's an amazing book, complete with incredible drawings of how to do layouts of all different construction techniques and other things like that. But this is really a compendium of a lot of older descriptives and information like that. So that was the last one. I hope I've added to it. I didn't want to get into the Moxon and the Diderot because I think those were probably some of the earliest, but I think, again, what Steve said and Jim, that those were meant for not necessarily the elite, but certainly the educated. And there were a great many wealthy men that studied the arts and architecture and designs, and they had beautiful libraries and had great information in them and everything, but it wasn't necessarily to be shared with the common worker because we had the apprentice system for teaching the tradesmen and passing that information on. And then we had those unions and things like that that tried to hold tight to the secrets of building. But there had to have been some communication with the designers, engineers, and architects and the common workmen. So there was some sort of a communication between them. At any rate, that was my sharing.
Thanks, Jester. It's been a great evening. We've had so many people share a huge amount of information, huge amount of knowledge, and I'm very grateful. I think we all are. And on that note, we should all raise a glass and toast to the bench.
To the bench.
Bench and the library.
To the bench.
And to the library.
To the bench.